Hello and welcome to my channel, I Win to Lose Gaming. Today we are going to do a quick and dirty guide for our brand new 5-star Pyro Claymore character, Dehya. Now for those of us that are willing to invest into future impact and have our Aromite Queen Dehya already, well, this guide is going to be for you as of today, prior to really any sort of buffs or anything for Dehya. So just keep in mind that things might change a lot in the future, but if you're planning on using her now, well, hopefully this guide can help you out a little bit. We're going to go through 3 main builds for Dehya. The first one is going to be a pure pyro build. The second one is going to be a vape focus build. And the third one is just going to be like a more general support build. Let's kick things off like we always do by talking about Dehya's talents. Starting with her normal attack, Sandstorm Assault. This is the typical normal attack stuff for most characters, and in Dehya's case, since she is a pyro character and her normal attacks are physical damage, you typically don't really need to do much of these, and they're also quite slow. Now, I've leveled them up purely for just a showcase, a single nuke showcase with her high plunge, or perhaps there's low plunge damage, because that actually happens to be her highest multiplier, especially without her Constellation 1. So yeah, we can just move on from her normal attacks now. And up next is her elemental skill. Now, there is a lot to say about her elemental skill, but there is a plop portion, a hop portion, and then a bop portion. These two, the plop and the hop, only scale off of attack, especially if Dehya is not at Constellation 1. So if she's at Constellation 0, these will only scale off her attack. And we see how the field damage does scale a little bit off of her max HP. Now let's talk a little bit about what it does. This thing provides a bit of resistance to interruption to the characters inside of it. However, that resistance to interruption is actually pretty difficult to notice unless it is during this first passive, while this first passive is active. 9 seconds after you plop this down, you will have a very significant amount of super armor thanks to this gold forge state, and it's typically even enough for a character like Ganyu to sit through a lot of attacks and shoot off her charge shots, which is functionally very similar to a shield in terms of the interrupt resist. Besides that, the elemental skill will deal this field damage once every 2.5 seconds if the enemy takes some damage while within her elemental skill circle. And also the ICD on her elemental skill, there is no ICD on the plop, there's no ICD on the hop, and there's no ICD on the bop. And because it has a 12-second duration, you are able to get 5 bops in total. Oftentimes though, it's only 4 bops, but hey, you know, who's counting, right? So each bop is guaranteed, from my observations, to give you 1 pyro particle. However, the plop and the hop do not generate any pyro particles, so you will typically get 4 to 5 pyro particles depending on how many bops you performed. Now, a couple more useful things to note is that while you're casting her E, the plop part of it, you actually do not have any super armor, so Dehya will easily be interrupted while she's actually trying to put down the first part of her elemental skill. Now, the hop portion, you can relocate it. However, it does not reset the cooldown of the bop. So if you just did a bop right before the hop, then you won't be able to get another bop immediately after the hop, and you still have to wait for that 2.5 second cooldown in order for the bop to be re-triggered again. So it does have a long 20-second cooldown, so you do have a significant amount of downtime, assuming you don't use your elemental burst, but we will talk about that later. Now, the last thing about this is that it does snapshot when you place it down, and then it re-snapshots when you do the hop, or if you replace it with her elemental burst. The next thing to talk about is her elemental burst. Literally one of the most important things about Dehya's elemental burst is that it does not work with Xingqiu or Yelan's elemental bursts. What this means is that despite mashing left click and appearing to kind of be like basic attack damage, she is not actually doing normal attacks, and therefore will not trigger things like Fischl's Constellation 6, Xingqiu's Rain Swords, as well as Yelan's coordinated attacks. This also means that all the damage that you see here is actually elemental burst damage, and it has nothing to do with normal attack multipliers or charge attack multipliers. It is purely just elemental burst damage. Now, it's a bit more straightforward than her elemental skill, but you go into her elemental burst state where you will just mash left click in order to do punches a lot faster, and each punch does this much damage, and it scales a bit off her HP and it scales more off of attack. And finally, after 10 punches, assuming you're mashing left click the whole time, she will do a finisher, slam to the ground. And as for its ICD, the punches have standard ICD, and because it's 10 hits, you will apply pyro on the 1st, 4th, 7th, and 10th punches, and the final slam attack does not have any ICD, or at least the ICD is not linked to the punches. So in total, you can actually vape 5 out of the 11 total hits on her elemental burst. So one more important thing to know about her elemental burst is that it actually puts away her elemental skill. So if you put the elemental skill down, use her elemental burst, she will put away the elemental skill. This means that the damage from her elemental skill isn't active while she's doing her elemental burst. On top of that, this means that the particles generated from her elemental skill will not be able to be generated, and assuming there is some time left over on her elemental skill, after her elemental burst, she will place down her elemental skill again with the remaining duration. But do keep in mind that when you do something like that, you are likely eating up the 9 seconds of the gold forged form state, because let's say you plop down her elemental skill, then you use her elemental burst, which takes roughly 6 to 7 seconds or something like that. That means that while you're doing your elemental burst, this 9 seconds of the gold forged state will be wasted in a sense, and your other characters will not gain the super duper armor. Speaking of super armor, her elemental burst effectively has perfect super armor from what I've seen. Outside of death and being frozen can knock her out of her elemental burst. Now, we did slightly talk about this passive, but it will also reduce 60% less damage while she's receiving damage from her red main's blood. The red main's blood damage is absorbed by allies taking damage within her Molten Inferno field. So you'll notice there's a little indicator near Dehya that shows that she is taking damage for her teammates' sake. And she can also take damage while she's off field. So this next passive just heals her a bit when she's under 40% HP. There's really not much else to say about it. And finally, this passive is similar to Rosaria's, except unlike for the nighttime, this is for the daytime. You will get a 10% movement speed bonus in the overworld if you use Dehya in your party between the times of 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. Now, in terms of talent priority, assuming you do want Dehya to do some damage, I would generally suggest prioritizing her elemental burst, then followed by her elemental skill, and you don't even need to level up her normal attacks, especially if you do not plan to use them at all. Alright, let's talk about her artifact options for the pure pyro damage build. So the pure pyro damage build, it effectively just aims to do as much pyro damage as possible. So looking at this damage maximized chart, we can see that the Emblem of Severed Fates is going to be a great artifact set for her burst damage. And the reason for this is because obviously it increases burst damage in relation to your energy recharge, and Dehya unfortunately does have a lot of energy issues, especially at Constellation 0. And we can see here that pretty much the two most recommended timepieces to run, either an attack percent depending on how many pyro characters you have in your team, or an energy recharge timepiece if you have less pyro characters on your team. We can see here that the Emblem Sever Fates with the attack percent timepiece will increase her burst damage by about 25% in comparison to having no set bonus, and the ER timepiece will still improve her damage by a significant 14% in comparison, thanks to the passive that provides bonus damage to her elemental burst. An HP percent timepiece is a bit more of an interesting choice, and unfortunately at Constellation 0 it just does not quite scale as well as an attack percent timepiece or an energy recharge timepiece. And honestly, when it comes to Dehya absorbing damage for your characters, having a little bit more HP is barely noticeable for the efficacy of that purpose. I would not use an HP percent timepiece until perhaps more Constellations, and we will talk about that a bit more down the road. Now, the next artifact set that's likely a decent choice as well, even for a pure pyro build, is the Tenacity of the Millilith. Tenacity of the Millilith provides 20% HP, which increases her damage by a little bit, And also, it also increases the attack percent of your entire party, which will provide a small 20% attack buff to the rest of them. The next artifact set, which is surprisingly viable on Dehya, is actually the Crimson Witch of Flames, even for a raw pyro build. And the reason for that is because you can actually use her elemental skill, then use her elemental skills hop, so the plop then the hop, and this will actually build 2 stacks on your Crimson Witch of Flames, which provides her in total 30% pyro damage bonus. But do keep in mind that you are sacrificing a lot of energy recharge, and you're still doing less damage than just an attack percent timepiece on the Emblem of Severed Fates. And there's actually one more artifact set that can be worth considering for Dehya, that is the Vermilion Hereafter, but I would assume it's pretty similar to the Crimson Witch of Flames, perhaps a little bit better, but it also needs significant amounts of ramp up time. By the time that this thing is fully stacked at around 3.2 seconds into her elemental burst, she's going to, already be almost done with it. So that's why I didn't even bother putting it on this chart. But if I had to guess, I'd give this roughly a 2.5 to 3 slime rating out of 5 slimes. Now, in terms of stat priority for Dehya at Constellation 0, overall, I would rank it as crit is greater than or equal to energy recharge, which is probably greater than or equal to attack percent, and finally, significantly greater than HP. At Constellation 1, this changes a little bit, with crit still being the #1 most important stat, followed by energy recharge, attack percent, and HP percent all being roughly equal to each other, depending on what you're going for, either more damage, which at Constellation 1 you do scale roughly the same with both attack percent and HP percent for elemental burst damage, or for burst uptime with energy recharge. So yeah, there's that to keep in mind if you do get her Constellation 1. So let's actually do something a little bit different for one of my guide videos and talk about how much energy recharge does Dehya need. Now, the reason why I typically avoid this discussion topic is because there are just too many assumptions that we need to make about energy recharge, so I've included a few scenarios for this. I'm assuming that we will somehow get 2 white particles from enemies, and Dehya will be on field when that happens, probably during her elemental burst. We can see here in this full chart, again, a lot of assumptions. For example, if Dehya is paired with Bennett, we are funneling 1 elemental skill worth of Bennett particles, and that elemental skill happens to generate 3 particles. But we can also see that when it comes to a pure pyro team with Dehya, Bennett, and Xiangling, she can get away with perhaps as low as 156% energy recharge in order to get her burst back up, thanks to the pyro particles that Guoba generates for the team. And however, if you just have Dehya and Bennett and you only funnel 1 Bennett elemental skill to Dehya, she may need as high as 183%, assuming the other 2 characters aren't pyro characters. And finally, if Dehya is with 3 non-pyro teammates, I would just suggest forgetting about trying to maintain Dehya burst uptime unless you're using something like Favonius. But we can see that without the Favonius or any other additional pyro particles, she's going to need a colossal 302% energy recharge in order to have 100% burst uptime. Next, let's talk about the weapons that Dehya can utilize, starting with the Beacon of the Reed Sea. This is a great no-nonsense stat stick for Dehya. Overall, this is her signature weapon, and it's actually just a pretty good weapon in general with crit rate, as well as with providing up to 40% attack with no nonsense. This gets a 5 slime out of 5 slime rating. The next weapon that's good for her, unsurprisingly, is the Wolf's Gravestone. And what's interesting about this is because her elemental burst does not snapshot, you're very likely to actually get a portion of her elemental burst with this thing's passive active. So the Wolf's Gravestone is actually slightly better on Dehya than many other characters for that reason. Up next in the list of 5-star weapons is the Unforged. Now, there is a little bit of ramp up time with this thing, but because her elemental burst does not snapshot, it actually works an advantage for the Unforged. However, again, you're probably not going to run Dehya with a shielder, so yeah, you won't really be exploiting the full advantages of the Unforged. But if you do actually run her in a team with a shielder, the Unforged is a pretty solid option. We also have the Red Horn Stone Thresher. Now, she doesn't really do normal or charged attacks, so unfortunately this passive is largely useless for her. However, this thing just provides a ton of crit damage, which is actually good for her, and it's just a no-nonsense stat stick for her. Now, a sleeper pick is the Akuaomaru, And the Aqua Maru provides a lot of elemental burst damage, especially at Refinement 5. And this is always one of the few weapons that I actually give different ratings for depending on the refinements. At Refinement 5, this thing is doing 95% of the burst damage as the Beacon of the Reed Sea, which is actually pretty crazy. So if you do have this thing at Refinement 5 and you don't have the Beacon of the Reed Sea, do consider using this, although the calculations here are based on 250 total team energy, which oftentimes you'll have more and sometimes you'll have less, so yeah. However, at Refinement 1, we can see that this damage is much lower at 83%, but it's still a pretty solid weapon even at Refinement 1. And what's nice about this is that let's say you invest into it, in the future you could get more refinements for this thing and therefore keep improving it. Now the next weapon is the Luxurious Sea Lord. The Luxurious Sea Lord is a fun looking weapon, but it's also just a decent weapon for her because of the 24% burst damage that it provides, as well as it having attack percent, which Dehya does scale fine off of. And we can see here that at Refinement 5, this thing's doing 80% of the Beacon of the Reed Sea, so it's a pretty solid free-to-play weapon option. Now the next weapon worth mentioning is the Skyward Pride. Skyward Pride provides 14% all damage, which does improve her elemental burst damage, and the energy recharge is also nice for maintaining burst uptime, so it still gets, you know, a reasonable 2.5 slime out of 5 slime rating. Now, a weapon that's definitely worth talking about is the Serpent Spine. Serpent Spine is a double-edged sword on Dehya, because if you use her elemental skill and any character in your party takes damage and then you swap Dehya back on the field, the DOT that she takes from the damage absorption from her teammates actually removes these stacks on the Serpent Spine. As such, it's actually counterproductive to use her elemental skill to provide super armor for her teammates because it will actually hurt her own personal damage when she actually swaps on. So overall, not really a weapon that I recommend strongly, but if somehow you can maintain all 5 stacks of this thing is a great weapon for her. Now, another interesting weapon for her is the Bell. Unfortunately though, again at Constellation 0, she does not scale that well off of HP. And for those that are curious about how the Bell performs, once you have Dehya's Constellation 1, which helps her scale with HP much better, the Bell will do roughly 81% of the burst damage that the Beacon of the Reed Sea will, so that puts it at around the same level as the Luxurious Sea Lord while needing the caveat of having a shield available. So overall, even at Constellation 1, I can't give this weapon any higher than a 2.5 slime rating out of 5 slimes. Now besides the Bell, the only other weapon I really want to talk about a little bit is the Sacrificial Greatsword. Sacrificial Greatsword has a really high chance of effectively activating it, and especially at Refinement 5, you will pretty much have 100% uptime on her elemental skill. But do absolutely remember that without the Gold Forged state, which has a 9-second duration and an 18-second cooldown, the super armor that her elemental skill provides does not really feel like it's very good. And on top of that, you typically don't care too much about a bunch of uptime on her elemental skill in terms of the pyro application it provides, or even the super armor that it provides outside of Gold Forged state. So that's why I'm not really strongly recommending the Sacrificial Greatsword. So if you want Dehya to actually do a lot of damage or as much damage as she really can, this is probably the best team for her to pull it off, and it's probably one of the easiest teams for her to pull it off with, and it is the Pure Pyro team. And this team, actually Xiangling pretty much does as much damage as Dehya does, and yeah, considering we're not even vaping Xiangling, that kind of goes to show you how much damage Dehya does in general. Honestly, isn't that much, but still, you can make her work pretty well with this team, and this is probably her most Unga Bunga straightforward and easiest to use team when it comes to her pure pyro damage build. Now, for the next build, I don't have as comprehensive charts as I did with the previous build, and there's really only 3 artifact sets strongly worth considering for this. The first one being Emblem of Sever Fates if you actually want to spam her elemental burst, because she needs a lot of energy recharge for a character at Constellation 0. Now for the timepiece though, you're going to want an Elemental Mastery timepiece for more damage, or an Energy Recharge timepiece for more uptime. The next artifact set worth talking about is the 4-piece Gilded Dreams. Obviously, we know what this does. This just provides a ton of Elemental Mastery. Not much to say here, except you'll have slightly worse burst uptime, but significantly better elemental skill vape damage. And remember, her elemental skill can vape up to 7 times, as it has no ICD. Now the next artifact set worth talking about is the Crimson Witch of Flames. You can definitely get 2 stacks on it thanks to you being able to use her elemental skill twice. Next, let's talk about weapons. Since we already kind of went through the explanation of the weapons, I'm just going to go through this pretty quickly. Overall, her best one's probably still going to be the Wolf's Gravestone. Again, I didn't do the exact math for this, but I'm pretty sure that my hunches are going to be pretty close to accurate here. Followed by the Wolf's Gravestone most likely, and then followed by a Refinement 5 Akuamaru. And after that, it's likely going to be the Rain Slasher. In particular, Rain Slasher is a great free-to-play friendly weapon option because you've probably gotten quite a few of these and might have this thing at Refinement 5. Obviously, this thing will do a lot more damage when you hit an enemy with Hydro on them. So let's talk about some characters that this Vape team can be used with. You can do kind of a dual carry situation with Ayato, who can be on field for a lot of it in order to vape Dehya's elemental skills, and then afterwards you can use Dehya to vape a bit with Ayato's elemental burst, and perhaps if you're able to get a Hydro infusion with Kazuha, then you can actually vape most of Dehya's elemental burst. And for the fourth character, generally Bennett is a great option for this. Now, most other vape setups that I've seen feel pretty awkward to use when it comes to Dehya, but you can vape most of the hits with Mona, and her elemental skill as well as her elemental burst can provide enough Hydro to vape most of her elemental burst. But typically speaking, this is a pretty awkward and inconsistent vape setup. Obviously, most other Hydro characters can also help vape, like Kokomi. And finally, the character that actually can vape Dehya's kit pretty consistently is Nilo. Nilo's elemental skill follows you around if you do her elemental skill 3 times, and this Hydro aura around you will actually apply Hydro quite a lot, which is enough to vape most or pretty much all of Dehya's damage. But sadly, outside of perhaps a quick nuke with Nilo, this team doesn't really have much synergy outside of that. So yeah, you're probably going to be disappointed based on the performance and damage output of this team, but Nilo is a character that can vape all of Dehya's stuff. Now obviously you can also use Tartaglia and have him on field for quite a bit in order to vape Dehya's elemental skill. You can think of it as a different variation, a worse variation of the Child International. Instead of Xiangling, we have Dehya. Obviously, Xiangling's going to do a lot more damage with her elemental burst vape than Dehya will because Xiangling has no ICD. So do keep that in mind when you do choose to use Dehya over Xiangling. Up next are her constellations. If you plan on burning a lot of money, this is the perfect section for you. Or if you also plan on losing a lot of your future 50/50s once Dehya is in the standard banner, this is a great section for you. Starting off with her Constellation 1, this adds a very significant amount of HP scaling to her elemental skill and her elemental burst. And at Constellation 1, HP percent ends up being roughly only 2 to 3% worse than attack percent. So she actually will scale really well off of HP percent at that point, and roughly equivalent to attack percent. Because of that, and because it actually increases her burst damage by a huge chunk, roughly 43% on top of her Constellation 0 and 37% for elemental skill damage on top of her Constellation 0. This is going to be the constellation that you want to get for Dehya if you do plan to actually have her make her do damage, a 5 slime at a 5 slime rating. Up next we have her Constellation 2, which after you use the plop and then you use the hop, you will actually extend its duration from 12 seconds to 18 seconds, therefore basically making it have almost close to 100% uptime, since the cooldown is 20 seconds. And it will also do 50% increased bop damage if a character in the circle got hit by something before the next bop. It also adds a couple more bops, making the total possible perhaps 7 bops. We can see that in total this will actually increase her elemental skills damage by 55%, and even a raw pyro version of Dehya will do roughly 101,000 damage with her full elemental skill damage, which is pretty significant at that point. So yeah, a great constellation, and I'm going to give this one a 4.5 slime rating out of 5 slimes. The next one is 3 levels to her elemental burst, which is okay, because the next one is her Constellation 4, which will heal her as well as provide energy for every punch that hits the enemy during her elemental burst. This will restore up to 16.5 energy, I believe, and largely solves her energy issues. Constellation 5 adds 3 levels to her elemental skill. and this will add roughly 70% damage on top of her elemental skill. Up next is her Constellation 6, which adds 10% crit rate to her elemental burst, and for every punch that she lands, it deals a critical hit, which we're assuming that you're pretty much just going to be critting every single hit at the very beginning. It will increase her crit damage by 15% for up to 60% crit damage after 4 punches. So this is a significant 25% increase roughly to her elemental burst damage, but do keep in mind that you will lose a tiny bit of damage on her elemental skill because your crit ratio is going to be a little bit more lopsided when you factor in the 10% crit rate bonus that you're going to subtract off of your elemental skill that you normally would actually have there. So yeah, that's why you actually lose a tiny bit of damage due to the slightly lopsided crit ratio. Finally, we can bring her signature weapon up to Refinement 5, which will provide a 16% damage bonus to everything in her kit. This is pretty in line with most refinements on signature weapons. You'll gain roughly 4% additional damage for each refinement. Obviously, it's poor value for Primo Gems, but whales are going to whale and they're going to get that extra bit of damage. Let's next talk about a pure support build for Dehya. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a little bit after all this time, but we're going to start off with the artifacts, and there are 2 main sets to really consider for a pure support Dehya build. The first one being the Tenacity of the Millith. For obvious reasons, her elemental skill can provide good uptime on the 20% attack buff that this artifact set provides. The next artifact set to consider is the 4-piece Instructor's Brooch, because with a pure support Dehya, you really don't care about her elemental burst uptime or honestly even her stats. She is a pretty viable user of the Instructor's 4-piece set bonus. Now for weapons, we have the Favonius Greatsword to provide energy, the Makhaira Aquamarine, which I would recommend with a 4-piece Tenacity set, and Elemental Mastery pieces in order to provide a reasonable, non-negligible attack buff to the entire team. Well, honestly only at Refinement 5 though, because at Refinement 1 it barely provides any attack bonus. Then we have the Forest Regalia, which is a good option, especially on a team where you want some burning involved, as this can provide 60 to 120 Elemental Mastery just by triggering burning. It does drop the leaf, which you have to play the dumb minigame and you have to try to pick it up, which can be pretty rough. And this in particular is really paired well with the 4-piece Instructors, as Dehya alone can provide up to 240 Elemental Mastery, as well as some super armor for her teammates. The next weapon worth considering is the Sacrificial Greatsword. This way you can shorten your rotation times because her elemental skill has a cooldown of 20 seconds, but this thing can shorten your rotations down to 16 seconds, which can actually make a big difference. And also it will provide 100% E uptime, although keep in mind, it does not provide 100% uptime on the Gold Forge Super Duper armor, and only provides a little bit of additional super armor outside of the Gold Forge state. So far, I've only really found support Dehya to be really good in one team, and this is with a Burning Melt Ganyu combination. And the reason why this is good is because Dehya provides the much needed super armor for Ganyu, and without using Zhongli, for example, you're able to provide a much higher amount of pyro application in order to have Ganyu melt much more reliably in comparison to having Zhongli instead of Dehya here. Now, outside of this team, I don't really feel strongly about using support Dehya, but you can kind of slap her in any team where the pyro is an inoffensive reaction, and she can provide small buffs as well as a little bit of super armor to your team. One possibility is that you can actually use Dehya to support Hu Tao with a double pyro, double hydra situation. Dehya will provide Hu Tao with a significant amount of super armor as well as with pyro resonance. Now, honestly, I prefer Zhongli for this role, but you can use Dehya as well if you want to. Now, I'm going to be honest, most other teams that you might try Dehya in, you're really just shoehorning her in to just, for the sake of using Dehya, and there's pretty much always a better option. Even in this team, there's a better option. Even in a pure power team, there's a better option. Even with Melt Ganyu, there's better variations of Melt Ganyu, for example. So yeah, sadly, Dehya is not really in a good spot in terms of viable teams right now, but that's also what I was saying at the beginning of this video. We are likely going to see a significant amount of changes to Dehya in the upcoming patches because Dehya is really suffering from the Kuki syndrome, in my opinion. Her kit is just not fully utilized by any team composition in the game at the moment. Yeah, we will probably need to do an updated guide once many more things that can synergize with Dehya's actual kit, and perhaps even a dedicated artifact set, stuff like that, because a lot of stuff is going to change once Dehya gets out of her Kuki syndrome situation. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is I Want to Lose, signing out.